The tracks were never empty until Karen blocked them. When I moved into Maple Ridge Estates, I expected peace. I expected calm walks at sunrise, barbecues with my neighbors, maybe the occasional potluck. What I didn't expect was an HOA president, with a power complex so strong that even a federal agency would roll their eyes. Her name? Karen Whitmore. Karen wasn't just a Karen by name, she was the CEO of petty tyranny. With her perfectly trimmed bob haircut, neon blazers, and a voice sharp enough to cut glass, she enforced HOA rules like a dictator with a clipboard. And it wasn't just about paint colors or lawn lengths. She had a vendetta against anyone who didn't bow to her self-appointed authority. The first time I crossed her path, it was over something small, my mailbox. Apparently, it was a few shades too dark compared to HOA guidelines. She took pictures, filed complaints, and sent me a warning letter that made it sound like I had committed a federal crime. I laughed it off at first. But that was my mistake, because Karen never forgets, she doesn't forgive. And she doesn't stop until you're either crushed beneath. HOA bylaws are gone, but what Karen didn't know was that I wasn't just a quiet homeowner. I was a man who operated heavy machinery for a living. More specifically, I was a train engineer, contracted to manage freight routes that ran dangerously close to our suburban edge. And when anyone parked too close to those tracks, it wasn't just a ticket risk. It was a matter of life or death. And one day, Karen parked her car right across them. The history of trouble, it started with subtle jabs. She began rejecting my lawn maintenance records, despite me using the same service as everyone else. My grass, according to her, didn't blend well with the community aesthetic. Then it was my trash cans. Apparently they were visible for too long. When I asked how long too long was, she smirked and said, "Long enough for me to see them." I thought maybe she had something personal against me. Maybe it was because I was new. Or maybe she just didn't like people who didn't fall in line with her robotic version of community order. Whatever it was, she made it her mission to make my life hell. But it wasn't just me. Over the months, I learned stories from neighbors. There was Bill, the retired Navy vet who got a $500 fine because his daughter's car had a bumper sticker Karen didn't like. Then there was old Mrs. Alvarez, who was nearly evicted for overwatering her lawn during the summer drought when all she did was wash her porch steps. Karen was on a power trip. But no one dared push back, except me. The HOA meeting that changed everything. At the quarterly HOA meeting, I stood up, calmly, respectfully. "I'd like to propose some changes," I said. "Specifically, I want a review board for citation disputes so that one person isn't making all the calls." The room froze. Karen, sitting at the head table in a lemon-yellow blazer, tilted her head and gave me a death glare hidden behind a rehearsed smile. "Well," she said sweetly, "if you don't like how things are done here, Mr. Bennett, you're always welcome to move." That was her go-to: move out, get lost, leave her little HOA kingdom behind. But I didn't move, and I didn't get quiet. I kept pushing, kept asking questions, and kept collecting stories from neighbors who had been wronged. Eventually, I started recording every interaction. I built a folder, Karen Crimes, I called it. But what I didn't know was that she had started building a file on me too, and it would lead to the day she made the biggest mistake of her life, the tracks and the warning. Our neighborhood was near an active freight line, mostly nighttime traffic, controlled, slow, and well-scheduled. There was one crossing in particular that everyone knew about, the service road behind the HOA community clubhouse. It wasn't an official crossing, just a paved utility path where freight engineers like me had clearance to pass in specific. Windows. Karine didn't like the tracks. She called them ugly and unsafe, even though they'd been there before the HOA ever existed. She wrote dozens of letters to the city, to the railway company, even to the Department of Transportation demanding they be removed or rerouted. Of course, none of that worked. the tracks stayed. And she hated them even more. One day, she put up illegal cones and a handwritten nitrogen monoxide entry HOA only sign near the tracks. I called the county office. They had it removed in a day. That same afternoon, I found a violation note on my front door. Trash lid unsecure. Third warning. I hadn't even put out the bins that day. The setup now. Here's the thing about rail freight work. It runs on precision. If a train is scheduled to pass through a private access lane at 2:05 p.m., it will pass through at 2:05 p.m., and I was scheduled to drive one that day, that morning. I received a call from my dispatcher. We've got a 72-car haul coming through the Maple Ridge utility lane, your route. Roger that, I said, and wrote it down. ETA, crosspoint at 2:05 p.m. Be there 5 minutes early to prep. Standard protocol. What I didn't expect when I arrived at 2 p.m. in the distance was a silver Lexus SUV parked diagonally. Across the track right on the access point, engine off, no one inside. And taped to the windshield, "This is HOA property, do not enter, violators will be fined." It didn't take long to find out who the vehicle belonged to. Karen's personalized plate said it all. KRN4HOA. Panic on the line. I radioed in immediately. "This is train 5123. Obstruction on line. Silver SUV on crossing path. Need visual ID and clearance instructions." Dispatcher. Say again? Karen parked her car on the damn tracks. Pause. Long pause. Is it in the hazard zone? It's right on the rails. ETA to contact? 3 minutes. My blood ran cold. I knew what was supposed to happen next. We'd engage emergency stop. I'd try to bring 2,500 tons of steel to a halt. But that only works if I see it in time, and today I had the benefit of foresight. What Karen didn't know is that I was the one driving. The one who had taken every fine, every insult, every harassment from her for over a year. And now she had parked her precious car on my tracks illegally. The final warning: I didn't want to destroy her car. I didn't want to cause chaos. But the truth is, once a freight train hits a certain point, stopping isn't as simple as hitting the brakes. I radioed one last time. Alert HOA. Vehicle must be moved in 90 seconds or impact is imminent. I also snapped photos that showed the SUV, the handwritten sign, the HOA sticker on the bumper. I had warned her. The entire community had. And as I sounded the horn and saw her come sprinting from the clubhouse, shrieking and flailing, it was already too late to stop completely. The aftermath of impact, the moment the train screeched and the steel wheels screamed against the tracks, everything turned into a blur of dust, metal, and panic. The emergency brakes engaged, but by the time a freight train carrying over 2,000 tons of cargo even begins to slow, it's already traveled the length of a football field. Karen's silver Lexus took the first hit right across the rear axle. It was like a soda can being crushed by a tank. The SUV didn't stand a chance. The back of the vehicle lifted and twisted with a shriek of rending metal. Its frame folded like paper, thrown off the track in a violent spiral of shattered glass and flying plastic. Luckily, no one was inside. She had made it out with mere seconds to spare, but her pride, her status, that, like the car, was completely totaled. After the initial impact, I coasted the engine down and brought the train to a slow stop. The dispatchers had already contacted local law enforcement and the railway safety inspectors. Within minutes, the scene was cordoned off with cones and hazard tape. The response was swift police cruisers with flashing lights, railway investigation, officers, even a fire truck for emergency precautions. And there she stood in the middle of it all. Karen Whitmore, clutching her designer purse like it was a life raft, screaming at every official in sight. She didn't cry. Karen didn't do tears. What she did was rage, indignant, righteous rage. Her voice sliced through the air, demanding to know who gave the train permission to be on her road, who was going to pay for her car, and why criminal trespassing charges were already being filed against me. I stepped out of the cabin slowly, removing my helmet, walking past officers and first responders. As soon as she saw me, her face twisted. The same expression I'd seen in every HOA meeting, every violation slip she left on my porch, except now it was full of pure disbelief. "You!" she shouted. "Of course it was you. You did this on purpose." The lead investigator, a grizzled man named Detective Calhoun, looked between us with narrowed eyes. "Ma'am," he said coolly. This man was operating a scheduled freight route, pre-authorized and documented. "Your car was parked on an illegal section of track marked for active service. Do you understand the severity of that?" Karen's mouth opened and closed like a malfunctioning robot. "I put up a sign," she stammered. "I closed that road. That's HOA property." "No, ma'am," Calhoun said again, this time with a tone of authority that finally cut through her nonsense. "That strip of road is owned by the county and leased for utility access to the railway. You don't have any jurisdiction there, and obstructing a federally regulated track? That's a felony offense." You could hear a pin drop. The residents, who had gathered nearby, watched in shocked silence. Even some HOA board members stood awkwardly behind yellow tape, unsure whether to defend her or distance themselves. Karen turned bright red. "I demand a lawyer," she said, but her voice shook. "I demand the HOA legal counsel immediately." Detective Calhoun folded his arms. "You're not under arrest yet, but you are being cited for obstruction of federal rail lines and public endangerment. A full investigation is underway. If I were you, I'd stop talking and start cooperating." She turned to me then, her eyes wild, her carefully composed facade unraveling like a fraying ribbon. "You set me up," she hissed. "This was your plan." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. I just looked at the investigators taking pictures of the wreckage, at the official timestamps from the railway system, at the dozens of eyewitnesses standing around who had seen her tape that handwritten sign to her windshield with smug satisfaction only an hour before dot, and then I turned and walked away. The community turns. The incident made the local news that very evening. HOA presidents. Car obliterated by freight train after parking on active tracks was the lead story on the evening broadcast. Reporters swarmed Maple Ridge the next morning. Helicopters flew overhead for aerial shots, and a video one of the neighbors had taken went viral overnight. The footage showed Karen yelling at police officers while the mangled remains of her Lexus smoldered in the background. It was comedy, tragedy, and karmic justice all wrapped into one. But more importantly, it was the turning point. Up until that day, Karen had ruled Maple Ridge through fear. People followed her because they were scared of fines, legal threats, and harassment. But now they saw she wasn't invincible. She had crossed a line literally and figuratively and had paid the price. For the first time, neighbors started talking openly. People who had once whispered complaints about her began showing up at emergency HOA meetings to demand answers. And at the center of it all was me. Says I wanted because I wanted to be a hero, but because people finally had someone who had stood up to her and survived. The next week, I was approached by a group of residents asking if I'd consider running for HOA president in the next special election. I nearly laughed out loud. Me? The guy she tried to find out of the neighborhood? But when I saw the look in their eyes, hopeful, tired, desperate for someone who actually cared, I said yes. Karen's counterattack, of course. Karen wasn't done. She never went down quietly. Within days of the accident, she filed a formal complaint with the HOA board, alleging I had orchestrated a malicious act of intimidation. She claimed I used my position as a train operator to threaten and terrorize her and called for my immediate removal from the community. She even tried to get a restraining order against me. But here's the thing about people. Like Karen, they're so used to being in control, they forget the rules apply to them too. Her complaint fell flat. The HOA board, many of whom had long grown tired of her power plays, rejected it unanimously. She showed up to the hearing with charts, diagrams, and even a printed-out timeline of my aggression. I countered with time-stamped logs from the train system, satellite images from the crossing, and a signed statement from the county confirming that the tracks were not, and never had been, under HOA authority. It was over before it began. Worse still for her, the HOA's legal advisor quietly informed her that due to the publicity, several major insurance companies were now investigating her liability for obstructing the federally active rail line. There was even the possibility of criminal charges pending. Her empire was collapsing. The quiet before the storm. For the first time since I had moved in, Karen stopped showing up to community events. Her house went dark most nights. Her minions, other board members who had once enforced her ridiculous rules, suddenly became polite, quiet, and oddly agreeable. I even received an anonymous apology letter with a $50 Starbucks gift card taped to it. I had a guess who sent it, but despite the seeming victory, I didn't celebrate. I knew her type too well. People like Karen don't just go away, they plot. They regroup. And sure enough, 2 weeks later, she made one final move that stunned the entire neighborhood. She announced she was suing the HOA claim that the board had failed to protect her rights as a resident and had allowed uncontrolled hostile elements, meaning me, to threaten her personal safety. She was seeking damages for emotional distress, vehicle loss, and reputational harm. The lawsuit was wild, desperate, and full of holes, but it was loud. And lawsuits, even the ridiculous ones, get attention. That was when the board finally suspended her from her position pending investigation. But that wasn't enough for me, because I knew something about that day on the tracks, something I hadn't shared with anyone yet. Something on the camera feed from the engineer's cabin. Karen hadn't just parked that SUV there by accident. She had watched the train schedule. She knew my shift. She had planned it all. Secrets behind the sign. 3 weeks had passed since Karen's SUV met its steel fate under my freight engine. 3 weeks since the local news cycle spun her into a laughingstock and the HOA board suspended her from her throne. But as any seasoned survivor of HOA horror knows, when a tyrant retreats into silence, it's never the end. It's only the eye of the storm. At first, Maple Ridge breathed a sigh of relief. The neighborhood became lighter, freer. Lawns were no longer scrutinized. People stopped hiding their garden gnomes, and kids played in the cul-de-sacs again without fear of receiving a citation for unauthorized chalk art. There were even rumors that the HOA board, no longer under Karen's iron fist, was preparing to rewrite the bylaws to make them less militant and more human. I even had neighbors coming up to me with fresh-baked pies and thank-you notes, calling me the train man who derailed the Queen. But I couldn't relax. Something wasn't right. You see, there's a certain flavor of obsession that clings to people like Karen. A need not just to win, but to dominate. She didn't just want her car back or to save face. She wanted revenge. And the lawsuit she had filed, though baseless and loud, was just a smokescreen. The real threat came when I received a manila envelope taped to my front door. No name, no address. Just the words, "You should have stayed quiet." The footage that changed everything. Inside the envelope was a flash drive. I stared at it for a long time before inserting it into my laptop. I had no idea who sent it. Maybe it was Karen. Maybe it was someone else. But what I found nearly made me sick. The file was labeled TRK_CAM_2:05 p.m. The timestamp of the crash. It was a copy of the cabin footage from my train footage. I hadn't even reviewed myself yet. We always archived camera recordings for legal and insurance reasons, and I knew someone must have pulled it for the investigation. But this copy, It had something different. The recording opened with a wide-angle view from the front of the train, showing the tracks ahead, the trees, the crossing path, and Karen. She was already there waiting. At first, she stood beside her car, holding her phone, pacing like she was expecting someone. Then, slowly, she drove her Lexus up the paved access lane and parked it directly across the rails, not near them. Not accidentally close, directly across the tracks. She stepped out, smoothed her blazer, then pulled a folded piece of paper from her purse and taped it to the windshield. Private road, do not enter. HOA property. Then, the worst part, she pulled out her phone and took pictures of her own vehicle from different angles, not to report anything, not for documentation, but like she was staging a scene. My hands tightened into fists as the footage continued. She turned around, walked calmly toward the clubhouse, and disappeared inside. She knew the schedule. She knew I was the one driving that train, and she didn't just happen to park there. She put that vehicle on the track's dash intentionally to send a message. Maybe she never thought it would get destroyed. Maybe she thought we'd stop or swerve or turn around. But this was a freight train, not a bicycle. And Karen had weaponized her own car just to try and trap me into something catastrophic. Confronting the board, the very next day, I requested a private emergency session with the HOA board. With the footage loaded onto a drive, I walked into the clubhouse's conference room and set it up on the large TV, usually reserved for dull maintenance budget presentations. 5 of the 7 board members showed up. 2 had recently resigned, citing stress and embarrassment over Karen's behavior. The remaining 5 residents like me, who had once rubber-stamped every one of Karen's ridiculous policies, now sat nervously, unsure of what I was about to show. I said nothing at first. I let the footage play in complete silence. When it ended, I turned toward them and asked the only question that mattered: how long have you known? The room was silent. It was Harold, an older man who had once proudly seconded Karen's motion to outlaw Halloween decorations, who finally spoke. She told us it was an accident, he muttered. Said she stopped there for a moment and didn't realize the time. She swore the sign was to keep vandals out. We believed her. No, I said calmly. You didn't want to believe the alternative. Marta, the secretary, looked genuinely shaken. Are you saying she tried to frame you? 'Cause a crash. She parked a car on active tracks and took photos of it, I said, trying to control my voice, knowing I was scheduled to drive that route. She tried to make it look like I was reckless, like I was a danger to the neighborhood. And if something went wrong, added one of the other members, his voice hollow, it wouldn't have just been you. That train was carrying industrial fuel tanks. A full derailment could have killed dozens of us. I nodded slowly. That's why I need your support. This isn't just about an HOA dispute anymore. This is criminal. Filing the charges, we took the footage directly to the sheriff's office. The lead investigator, Detective Calhoun, called in the state's Transportation Safety Board and federal railway inspectors. Within 48 hours, Karen's home was searched under warrant. Her devices were confiscated, and her HOA account history was placed under legal scrutiny. The most damning piece? Her private calendar. On the day of the crash, she had scheduled a 1-hour block labeled Staging, 2 p.m. And then came the messages text recovered from her phone between her and an unnamed contact, listed only as WC. He won't shut up about the bylaws. I'm going to scare him. You're not seriously thinking of using the train thing? Just long enough to get some pics. I want the HOA to see he's dangerous. Karen's arrest, the arrest was quiet, no media. No handcuffs on the front lawn. They picked her up from a boutique spa on the edge of town where she was getting her nails done. She didn't even resist, just muttered something about political theater and HOA sabotage as they let her out. The charges were formal: reckless endangerment, obstruction of federal infrastructure, falsifying evidence, and attempted entrapment. The neighborhood exploded. News vans returned. Karen's image, once a symbol of suburban control, now graced every news outlet as an example of a power gone rogue. Maple Ridge was no longer just another gated community. It was ground zero for one of the wildest HOA scandals in state history. But for me, it wasn't about headlines. It was about healing. The first real HOA meeting, a month later, we held our first public HOA meeting without Karen. The room was packed. For the first time, people laughed, shared stories, and proposed reasonable rules. The trash bin wars were over. People stopped measuring grass height with rulers. No more threats. No more fines for minor infractions. Just neighbors. Trying to be neighbors again. At the end of the meeting, Marta handed me a small wooden plaque. It read, "For keeping the tracks clear." I laughed. I couldn't help it. For once, that phrase meant something more than just rail lines. The court of public opinion. It had been 3 months since Karen was taken into custody, yet the ripples of her downfall continued to shake every corner of Maple Ridge. The community that once trembled under her threats had evolved. The cul-de-sacs, which were once silent and cautious, now buzzed with new life. Neighbors who used to avoid one another behind hedges and blinds now met over coffee and talked about more than violations. They talked about unity, accountability, and healing. Yet for me, the storm wasn't over, not by a long shot. You see, while the legal system worked through the mountain of charges against Karen, she hadn't truly disappeared. Yes, she was no longer strutting around the neighborhood, clipboard in hand, issuing citations for trash bins left out 10 minutes too long. But she wasn't done fighting. Not by a long shot. The lawsuit she filed against the though completely baseless, was still on the books. Her legal team, a ruthless pack of civil litigators from the city, continued to send discovery motions, deposition notices, and accusatory filings loaded with slander and half-truths. She wasn't fighting to win in court. She was fighting to tarnish reputations, especially mine. Karen had always cared about appearances more than truth. And now, stripped of her authority, her Lexus, and her iron grip on the community, she turned to the only battleground left where manipulation still held power: the court of public opinion. The smear campaign begins. It started online. A Facebook group called Save Maple Ridge appeared, hosted under the name Concerned Homeowner 57. Its posts dripped with vague accusations: unstable HOA, dangerous individuals in charge, and train engineer abused authority. It didn't take long to figure out who was behind it. The writing style was unmistakably Karen's, long-winded, pompous, and saturated with overused legal terms like malfeasance, gross negligence, and willful misconduct. At first, it was just digital noise. But then, flyers began appearing in mailboxes. Professionally printed pamphlets warning that criminals had infiltrated the HOA and urging neighbors to resist the power grab by false leaders. My name wasn't printed, but I was referenced enough times to know I was the primary target. One afternoon, I returned home to find the side of my mailbox tagged with red spray paint. Traitor. That was the last straw. I had tried to take the high road. I didn't post responses, didn't engage with her attempts to drag me down. But now she had crossed the line into harassment again. Only this time, she was doing it under the guise of free speech and anonymous defamation. I contacted the HOA board immediately, and to their credit, they responded fast. A meeting was held. Public, transparent. Neighbors packed the community. Hall to standing room only. Facing the fire again. When I entered the meeting that night, I expected tension. What I didn't expect was applause. It started with one neighbor, then two, then a full crowd. I stood there stunned as people I barely knew shook my hand, thanked me, even hugged me. And yet, I knew why we were really there. I stood at the podium and raised my voice not with anger, but with resolve. This neighborhood was never supposed to be about fear, I began. It wasn't supposed to be about threats, fines, or harassment. It's supposed to be a place where families grow, where we feel safe, where we help each other. The room fell silent, and yes, I continued, I drove the train that destroyed her car, but I didn't destroy her. She did that herself with every lie, every abuse of power, every time she used rules to divide us instead of protect us. And now she wants to spin the story and make me the villain. But let's be very clear, this community doesn't belong to one person anymore. The applause was louder this time. What came next surprised even me. Harold, the former board member who once stood by Karen for every ridiculous rule she proposed, stepped forward with a manila folder in his hands. I found these, he said, placing them on the podium. Internal emails between Karen and a few of us board members. She tried to make us cover for her after the crash. She told us to say we authorized the sign she put on her car window. But we didn't. We never saw that sign before the day of the incident. She lied. Gasps echoed in the room. Even I hadn't seen this coming. It was the first time someone from her own inner circle had stepped forward with hard evidence. The folder was passed around, copies made, scanned and archived. Karen's credibility, already crumbling, now lay in shambles. The trial date is set just 2 weeks later. The district attorney officially announced that the charges against Karen Whitmore would go to trial. The hearing would be public. Evidence presented would include everything, from the train cam footage to the incriminating texts, the staged photos, and now, thanks to Harold, the internal HOA communications proving she tried to manipulate the board. Karen's legal team immediately tried to delay the trial, citing emotional instability and requesting a psychiatric evaluation. It was a transparent tactic to stall for time. But the court refused. The judge ruled that her actions showed intentional, deliberate behavior and that she would stand trial in open court. The hearing was scheduled for early spring, and though I should have felt relief, I felt something else entirely, the weight of it all. Because while the legal battle was important, the deeper issue remained, the damage she had done to a community's trust, the neighbors she had bullied, the elderly couple she had fined into financial hardship, the single mother she tried to evict over a fence 2 inches too tall. These weren't just stories. They were scars. The unexpected visitor then, on a rainy afternoon in March, something happened I didn't expect. A knock at my door, not aggressive, not forceful, just tired. When I opened it, I saw Walter Cooper, a quiet man from 3 blocks over. Retired teacher. Lived alone. Always kept to himself. I had seen him at meetings but never really spoken to him. I need to talk, he said softly, holding an umbrella in one hand and a small envelope in the other. I invited him in, poured him some coffee, and we sat. What's this? I asked, pointing to the envelope. It's the truth, he said. I used to be Karen's advisor, her consultant, she called me. She paid me under the table to write legal letters for her to intimidate residents into obedience. I never thought it'd get so far. Why now? I asked. He looked out the window for a long time before speaking. Because she's going to lose. But she's going to take as many people down with her as she can. She kept files on everyone. Dirt, secrets. She planned to leak them if things turned against her, and I think she still plans to. What's in that envelope? Every document I ghostwrote, every draft she approved, and proof she tried to blackmail Marta and Harold into backing her story. I stared at him, speechless. She'll come after you again, he said. But this time you'll be ready. The trial nobody expected spring came slowly to Maple Ridge. The flowers bloomed. Kids played freely in the streets again. And the lawns once meticulously measured under the shadow of Karen's tyranny grew with a quiet, welcome wildness. But beneath the surface, there was a storm brewing. The trial of Karen Whitmore, once the queen of our gated community, was now the talk of not just the neighborhood, but the entire county. Everyone had an opinion. Some believed justice had been long overdue. Others whispered doubts about how far she had really gone. But no one could ignore what was coming. After months of speculation, footage leaks, resignations, subpoenas, and threats, the day had finally arrived. The courtroom would be full. Reporters were already setting up camp. And despite her fall from grace, Corinne had one last card she was going to try to play. I hadn't planned on attending the pre-trial motions, but Marta insisted. She said the community needed someone there, someone they trusted. I didn't wear a suit. I didn't sit in the gallery with the crowd. I sat near the front, calm but alert, ready for whatever circus was about to unfold. Karen entered the courtroom, not in orange prison scrubs like some hoped, but in a pressed navy blue dress and heels. Her hair was styled, her makeup perfect. She walked in like she was attending a fundraiser brunch, not a hearing for federal obstruction charges. And just like that, the old Karen re-emerged, controlled, rehearsed, cold. But there was something behind her eyes now, not confidence, not power, just desperation hiding behind a smile. The opening barrage the prosecution wasted no time. They laid out a timeline, clean, clear, undeniable. The freight schedule, the signed route permissions, the digital logs, the train cam footage, the photos Karen took of her own car staged across the tracks. Then came the text messages she had sent to Walter Cooper, who had turned over the evidence. Every word, every emoji, every passive-aggressive plan she had crafted to discredit me and frame the incident as intentional intimidation was now out in the open, projected on a courtroom screen for all to see. Karen's defense team objected frequently, trying to spin the narrative. They claimed she had no criminal intent, that she was only attempting to bring awareness to what she believed was unsafe rail access near a residential zone. They argued that the entire event had been a misunderstanding, that her SUV had only been parked there for a moment, and that the train arrived ahead of schedule. But the prosecution's evidence buried those claims. They had timestamps, GPS data, and most damning of all, the footage from the HOA clubhouse security camera, newly uncovered and entered into evidence just the week before. The camera captured Karen leaving the building after the scheduled train time, meaning she had knowingly left her vehicle in place long enough to cause damage. It showed her checking her watch. It showed her standing behind a bush across the street, phone in hand, recording video as the train hit her car. She hadn't just miscalculated. She had orchestrated the moment. The room gasped. And I felt a lump rise in my throat, not because I was surprised, but because I finally saw what everyone else now saw clearly. She hadn't just wanted revenge, she had wanted a show. The witnesses speak one by one. Witnesses were called. Harold spoke first. His voice trembled, not from fear, but from shame. He admitted to following Karen blindly, to rubber stamping her enforcement actions without reading them, and to initially agreeing to lie on her behalf after the crash. Was honest about his guilt. Honest about how Karen manipulated the board with threats, shame, and veiled legal intimidation. Next came Marta. Her testimony was emotional, steady, and devastating. She told the court about the countless residents Karen had targeted, how she weaponized bylaws to force out renters she didn't approve of, to fine elderly residents for disruptive mailboxes, and how she installed hidden microphones in OO meetings to catch board members who questioned her. That revelation stopped the courtroom cold. It wasn't just about a car on a track anymore. It was about a pattern, a legacy of control and psychological warfare. And then they called me. I walked up, hands calm, voice steady. I gave the facts. I described my role, my route, my history in the neighborhood. I told the court how I'd received that violation notice on my mailbox the same afternoon, The illegal "do not enter" sign appeared taped to Karen's windshield. I spoke of her years of bullying, the warnings, the silence of the community under her rule. When the defense tried to rattle me, I stood firm. "Did you enjoy watching her car get destroyed?" The defense attorney asked with a smug look. "No," I answered. "I enjoyed surviving it." The gallery murmured. The judge nodded once and motioned to move on. Karen's final gamble. It wasn't until the last day of testimony that Karen took the stand. Her attorneys didn't want her to, but she insisted. She had always believed she was the smartest person in the room. She would control the narrative herself, just like she always had. She began her testimony like a performance. Soft-spoken, careful, she described herself as misunderstood, as someone trying to maintain safety and order in a chaotic world. She cried at the right times. She referenced growing up in a broken household and claimed her strict enforcement came from a place of structure and safety. But as the prosecution began cross-examination, the mask cracked. They presented the new footage frame by frame. The moment she hid behind the hedge. The moment she pressed record. The smirk as the train came into view. When asked why she hadn't attempted to remove the vehicle or warned the conductor, she faltered. When asked why she hadn't called emergency services or filed any formal safety concerns with the county prior to that day, she paused. And then came the text. "Let's see how big and brave he is when a train wipes out his life." The words were projected across the courtroom screen like a headline. Karen stared at them, frozen. The jury stared too. Her team didn't object. They knew they were done. The verdict. It took the jury less than 6 hours. Karen Whitmore was found guilty on all counts: reckless endangerment, obstruction of federal infrastructure, falsifying evidence, attempted entrapment, and multiple violations of HOA governance statutes. Her sentencing hearing was scheduled for the following month, with the judge recommending maximum penalties. Due to the calculated nature of her actions and her lack of remorse, the neighborhood watched as she was led away from the courtroom in cuffs. This time, there were no heels, no styled hair, no navy blue dress, just a jumpsuit, and silence. A new chapter begins in the weeks that followed. Maple Ridge came together in a way I never thought possible. The bylaws were rewritten fairly this time. The HOA board was expanded and democratized, giving every homeowner a vote. A new community council formed, not just for maintenance issues, but for events, discussions, and education. Residents who once feared speaking up now proudly put up wind chimes, painted their fences, and hosted backyard movie nights. Kids chalked the sidewalks in peace. As for me, I stayed. People asked me if I ever thought about moving, about putting the past behind me. But the truth was, I didn't want to leave. This place had become more than a neighborhood. It had become a testament to what happens when people finally stand up to fear. I no longer drove that train route. After the trial, I switched divisions. But I kept the conductor's cap, the one I wore the day justice roared down the tracks. It sat on a shelf above my desk, next to the framed screenshot of the verdict headline. And every now and then, I'd hear the distant whistle of a train at night and smile, not because of what it destroyed, but because of what it made possible. Legacy of the tracks. Months passed since the gavel fell, and Karen Whitmore was sentenced. She was given 5 years, with the first 2 to be served in a minimum security federal facility and the rest on house arrest with a mandated ban from holding any leadership role in community or legal organizations for a decade. Her name had become not just infamous in Maple Ridge, but symbolic across the country. News outlets labeled her the train wreck president, while others turned her into a cautionary tale of what happens when unchecked power meets obsession. But while the media feasted on her downfall, our small neighborhood quietly went through something far more profound, a rebirth. Maple Ridge, once a place of fear and whispers, became alive with unity and purpose. We started with the basics rewriting. The HOA charter, so that no single person could ever again consolidate the kind of control Karen once wielded. Decisions now required public consensus. Violations had to be voted on, and appeals were now treated with dignity. Enforcement wasn't done by fear, but by conversation. A new motto was painted on the community center wall: respect, not regulation. But, more than the laws or procedures, it was the people who changed. Neighbors began hosting community breakfasts on weekends. People mowed each other's lawns when someone was sick. Retired veterans offered free handyman services for widows and single parents. A book-sharing box was built at the end of every street. Laughter returned. And for the first time, everyone felt like they were truly home. Yet for me, despite the peace, there remained a shadow. Not one cast by Karen herself, but by the role I'd played. Because while I hadn't caused the crash, I was the one driving that train. And no matter how justified everyone said I was, no matter how many people thanked me for standing up, there were nights I'd sit quietly on my porch and wonder, could it have ended differently? The letter from prison one rainy morning in early fall. I received a letter postmarked from the Federal Correctional Center upstate. No return name, just a number. But I knew who it was from before I opened it. Karen's handwriting was unmistakable, precise. Neat, aggressively symmetrical. I suppose you think you won. I suppose everyone does. You drove the train. You stood in front of the crowd and smiled while they cheered your name. And yes, the jury made its choice. But I want you to understand something. I was trying to protect this place. Maybe I went too far. Maybe I lost control. But I wasn't the villain. I was the spine. And when you took me out, you didn't just humiliate me. You opened the door to chaos. You'll see it, sooner or later. They always want order until it gets uncomfortable. You've got your happy little democracy now. Let's see how long it lasts. There was no apology. No remorse. Just bitterness sealed in ink. I folded the letter and slid it into the box where I kept everything from this strange chapter of my life: photos, court transcripts, HOA newsletters, even the conductor's log from the day of the crash. That box sat in the back of my closet, not out of sight, but out of reach. A reminder, not a trophy. The Karen files. What most people didn't know was that Karen had left behind a digital graveyard. The encrypted files she had stored on a private HOA server were turned over to the authorities after her conviction. Thousands of documents, emails, audio recordings, blackmail threats, even psychological profiles she had created on residents, each categorized by name, property, lot, and what she believed was their weakness. The files included notes like, Lot 22, Jameson, drinks too much, threatened code compliance. Lot 47, Nguyen, undocumented brother lives in basement, intimidate with ICE rumors. Lot 13, Cooper, lonely, craves power. Use guilt. Praise to control. It was chilling. But it also gave the community closure. When these files were revealed carefully and respectfully, residents saw that their fears had been real, that their paranoia hadn't been imagined. They'd been watched, manipulated, used, but now they were free. Walter Cooper, who had once ghostwritten those letters for her, became instrumental in organizing what we called the Healing Wall, a space in the community center where residents could write their stories, anonymously or not. It became a patchwork of heartbreak and hope. Some wrote about years of silence, others about threats they never dared report. And some wrote about forgiveness. The final meeting 1 year after the crash, the HOA held its first full community anniversary celebration. We called it Trackside Day. There were bounce houses, food trucks, music, even a miniature model train ride for kids. It was festive, light-hearted, but rooted in history. At the center of the park, a new metal sculpture had been unveiled. It was abstract, twisting rails intertwined with fractured gears, emerging into open wings. At the base, a plaque read, From steel comes strength, from conflict, community. It wasn't about Karen. It wasn't even about me. It was about all of us. During the celebration, Marta pulled me aside and placed something in my hands. It was a wooden replica of the original HOA gavel. On the handle was carved a single word: balance. "We're not perfect," she said, smiling, "but we're finally free." A legacy rewritten. People ask me sometimes what became of Karen. After her sentencing, she tried to appeal, but the courts rejected it. She's still serving her time. I've heard rumors that she spends most of her days in the prison library, still organizing things, still trying to control something. But I stopped following the updates. Not because I don't care, but because she no longer controls anything here. Maple Ridge became a case study for HOA reform. Cities from around the country reached out for our updated governance model. Our bylaws were published in a housing ethics journal. Law students cited our case as precedent for community overreach. And through it all, I stayed quiet, steady, a conductor of peace this time instead of a train. In the end, Karen thought she was the only one who could protect the neighborhood. But the truth was, she was the one it needed protecting from. And sometimes, the very structure someone builds to hold power becomes the wreckage they leave behind. So yes, I drove that train, and it didn't just crush a car. It cleared the tracks for something better.